This is a response to an article I just read on IO9, which is linked below. And it's called Staircases. The original article is called Staircases in Space, Why Are Places in Science Fiction Not Wheelchair Accessible? And it's written by a woman named Ace Ratcliff, who is herself confined to a wheelchair. And I wanted to respond to this, and I wanted to respond with as constructive and thoughtful a tone as possible because it brought a lot to my mind that I would like to get out there and would like to address. To Ace Ratcliff, I do not know you. I have no personal vendetta against you, and I am not doing this to attack you. And I say this because it seems like that's the go-to assumption for a lot of people. I readily and wholeheartedly admit that I am, at this point in my life, not wheelchair bound, not I guess I would say able-bodied overall, and so I am certainly not encountering the life struggles that you've encountered, and I don't want to negate that. If you do, and I want to reemphasize, this is not an attack on you. If you see it that way, however, I would hope that you will have the intellectual honesty to look within yourself and ask yourself if you are seeing it that way because you truly feel attacked or because you are trying to deflect criticism. So, the article in question talks about how once Ace Ratcliff became, or started using a wheelchair, I should say, she began to notice that so many of the most well-known locations and settings in science fiction, things like the TARDIS in Doctor Who and the Starship Enterprise and all of that, are not handicapped accessible. There's no wheelchair ramps. There's no there are no repositioned access panels and that kind of thing for people who are in a sitting position and things like that. And as I was reading the article, my natural response to it was the natural response that I think a lot of people who are hearing this now are probably already having, which was I immediately thought, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. And the point being that in so much of science fiction, when we do encounter disabled persons, things come to mind like, Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker using prosthetic devices or the ability to heal most bodily injuries in Star Trek, or, the consciousness transfer to an able body like we see in Avatar and things like that. Most of the time, it is treated as something that is solved by the forward march and forward progression of technology. And so, of course, that immediately came to mind, and that was my automatic response. And Ms. Radcliffe answered that by saying in the article, quote, "Contrary to ableist opinion, a utopia is not a world where disability is a problem that's been solved. Rather, it's an inevitable expression of genetic variance, and disabled humans are not just welcomed but fully included," close quote. So I really do have a problem with that perspective, and I feel like it feeds into, or rather, I should say, is predicated on a fundamental divide between who we are as a people and who we're aspiring to be as a people and where we want to go as a society. And one of the things that science fiction does is it encourages us to think. You ever notice how you very seldom in science fiction, with the exception of very densely written science fiction like Dune, you very seldom see each planet having a bunch of different subgroups. It's usually we land on a planet and you meet the president of Mars or whatever. It's like the planet has been unified. And part of that is just a natural condensing for simplicity's sake for the writing. But also I think it suggests that, when we're dealing with when we're dealing with species, we're at the species level, humans meeting Martians or whatever, we are taking into account the fundamental thrust of the overarching needs of that species. And so there is a sense of unity, a sense of unification that seems natural, that, this type of being, this type of intelligent being is going to have these overarching needs, goals, and desires, etc. And as I think about that, you say, contrary to ableist opinion, and I have to take exception to that because, there's that again is that automatic knee-jerk default assumption that, and I feel, I'm not trying to be funny when I say this, but when I realized when I just said knee-jerk, I realized that sounded incredibly insensitive, and I do apologize for that. But there's that automatic assumption that, well, every ableist person or every able-bodied person thinks this way. Also, I take exception with the idea that there's such a thing as ableism, because it implies, when you put an ism to it, it implies a codified system of thought. Like you could go to, you say if you're a racist, you see the world this way, or if you're a sexist, you see the world this way. I feel like ableist is a little bit of a different animal, because we are talking about problems that need to be addressed. Even if your perspective on those problems is not solve the problems themselves, but rather create a world where those problems are accommodated, then you're still addressing the fact that there's this fundamental separation that has to be somehow addressed by the larger society. So you can't get away from the idea that at a fundamental level, this is how you want able-bodied people to, that the question here is, how should able-bodied people react to non-able-bodied people? And that comes down to, I think, a fundamental question, which is, do we want stasis or expansion? We are, the human beings, living life forms can go one of two ways. They can go the way of entropy, or they can go the way of evolution. Species that are not adaptable to change don't survive. And the fundamental essence of science fiction is that what will make us ultimately adaptable to change long term is our capacity for scientific and technological advancement. So when we think about science fiction not featuring handicapable people or handicapped people, or I should say, rather not featuring a handicapped, accessible world, because people that would otherwise be handicapped have had that issue corrected. I don't see that as a smack in the face to the physically incapable. I see it as a natural forward step, a natural outgrowth of the essence of science fiction. So, if you wanted to address those problems in science fiction, you would almost have to somehow find a way to write a story where handicapped persons are being disadvantaged or mistreated in some way because of their condition and a society that doesn't respect it. So you would have to work the kind of Frankenstein's monster, it's alive angle. And what I mean by that is the technology run amok angle, which is used in a lot of dystopian science fiction and that kind of thing. But again, it seems very difficult to make that case because it's almost impossible to conceive of a world where the ideal solution is not returning people to an able-bodied state. It comes down to a fundamental difference in perspective, I think, the teach a man to fish attitude. This is an article from the perspective of, why should we not, if this man can't fish, Why should we not be giving him fish? And the answer to that is, well, we have the technology to make him self-sustaining and self-sufficient so that he can fish on his own and provide for himself, and that's the best of all possible solutions because his problem is solved, but it's not a burden of any kind on everybody else. And so that's where we get this interesting kind of change of perspective. And I say it's a change of perspective rather than a counter argument because it really kind of ignores that existing question. It sidesteps that question and sort of tacitly implies that the larger sort of expansion towards welfare state is the implicit morally right solution. And that is to say that this thing about handicap status becoming a statement of personal identity. That and she goes on to elaborate on this in the article that we as able-bodied persons can't or find it difficult to understand how being handicapped is a part of who you are. As a part of your identity, and it's not something that you want to be. It's not a problem that you want to have solved. And again, it comes back to you're right. I don't have the perspective that it is morally good to continue being handicapped if technology will allow you to return to being able-bodied. You're right. I don't have that perspective. But I have to ask you then, are you so shallow as a person? Is your identity so otherwise devoid of defining characteristics that being handicapped is what makes you you? Because to honestly view being able-bodied as a form of non-individualizing conformity is very bizarre and almost perverse to me. And the best argument I can make for that is the example of Jason Becker. Jason Becker is my all-time favorite guitarist. He is an amazing guitarist. Go get his album Perpetual Burn. It's on, Apple Music and Spotify. You can stream it. Go listen to Perpetual Burn. And by the time Altitudes is over, but the first track, Altitudes, which is one of his masterpieces, that's on par with like Steve Vai, For the Love of God, as far as like defining guitar performances. By the time that piece is over, you will see instantly why he is my favorite guitarist of all time. Just in the first track, Altitudes, just listen to that. The breadth and width of virtuosity and skill and composition and musicality and harmony and everything is extraordinary. It is almost superhuman. And I know, from my own educational background, that album is taught at the college level alongside great enduring classics of modern music. Well, that album was recorded by Jason Becker, a child prodigy, when he was in his late teens and early 20s. He was, by all accounts, in the late 1980s, Jason Becker was, by all accounts, en route to becoming the next great guitar virtuoso alongside Steve Vai, Joe Satriani. By the time, by the end of the 80s, Jason Becker was poised to become the next standout major guitar god virtuoso. He had just joined David Lee Roth's band, and he was poised to take the world by storm. There was no doubt in anyone's mind. All of the magazines, all of the trade publications, all of the guitar companies, all the other players, everybody was saying Jason Becker is going to be the next big thing. And then Jason Becker was struck down not even in his prime, before his prime had even begun. He was struck down by Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He lost his ability to move, which meant he could no longer play the guitar. He could no longer play the guitar. He could no longer write music. He could no longer even take care of himself. He is still alive to this day, 30 some odd years later. He is still alive to this day, but he is maintained, his existence is maintained by a group of family members and caregivers, round-the-clock caregivers. He has lost all physical motion except for his ability to use his eyes. He can move his eyes, and with the ability to do that, he is able to communicate and continue to write music, which is extraordinary. Now, this is what it comes down to. This is what it comes down to. Do you go to Jason Becker and say, we can give you we have the technology to cure you, assuming that it exists, we're, in a science fiction world where we do have that technology. We go to Jason Becker and say, we have the technology to cure you, and you can now play guitar again, the thing you love more than anything in the world, the thing that has given you an almost superhuman status in the minds of millions of people. We can return that ability to you, and we can give you an existence where you can care for yourself, and you don't, your family doesn't have to worry about you, and you don't have to worry about what you're going to do when they're not around to take care of you anymore. We can give that to you. Or do you go to Jason Becker and tell him, we're not going to treat you, and we're not going to make you better. We're not going to heal you. We're not going to give you the ability to play guitar again because we feel like you being paralyzed is what makes you special. Not the fact that you can play guitar on the superhuman level. That's not what we want, why we want you to feel special. We want you to have your individual identity be based on the fact that you cannot physically move. That, to me, is an unbelievably heartless perspective to take. So for that reason, I don't want to envision a world of tomorrow that is endlessly modified for handicapped access. I want to envision a world where the blind can see, where the paralyzed can walk, where the mute can speak, where the physically infirm are strong and healthy. And I know that when I say that, in a lot of people's minds, there's this there's this weird twitch, and I used to have this weird twitch too. There's this weird twitch when you talk about being able to make people physically healthy again and that kind of thing. They immediately assume that you're like quietly suggesting some sort of Nazi eugenics program or something like that. No. The essence of the Nazi eugenics program was that they thought they could breed physical infirmity out of existence and euthanize the people that were born that were physically infirm. That is absolutely monstrous, and that is not what I'm suggesting. What I am suggesting is that you be able to use science and technology to improve the quality of life for disabled persons. I don't have it in me to tell a disabled person, you shouldn't be helped because this disability you have is a part of your identity and it makes you you. If that makes me heartless, then I'm heartless. And I feel like I wanted to really make this point and really say this because I feel like we now live in a world where people are not, I feel like we live in a world now when it comes to our public discourse where an idea is put forth in the basic formula here is an idea is put forth in a prominent public space, in this case IO9, and the suggestion is not, the underlying implication of the idea is not an invitation to discuss the merits of the idea, positive or negative. The underlying implication is that it's now, what we're actually doing is drawing a line in the sand, and that the world is suddenly now divided into good people who agree with the stated opinion and bad people who disagree. And that's, I think, a very toxic and very negative environment intellectually. And it's strange that we now have what's known as the intellectual dark web, which was a term coined by Eric Weinstein to refer to himself, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, I think Sam Harrison, Dave Rubin, and a few other people like that, they are a group of people who see the world in radically different ways, but they find it beneficial to sit down and talk about their perspectives and dialogue and actually try to hash out new ideas and higher ground. That's healthy. That's where we need to be. And so, bearing that in mind, I have to lay out the final question, which is, why is it that we now seem to have progressives that are against progress? I don't know that Ace Ratcliff identifies as progressive or not, but she's certainly someone who, if it quacks like a duck and sheds water like a duck, then it's probably a duck. And bearing that in mind, I have to assume that progressive is a term that describes her, and she's certainly writing for a progressive publication. Why are progressives against progress? It comes back to what we assume is a progressive economic model, which is this idea of tax the rich, redistribution, kind of this socialist mentality. It's not progressive. Functionally it's retrograde. It's actually functionally a push towards entropy, a push towards a society that collapses. And that's the problem. Again, we come back to, do you want an entropic society or an evolving society? And I will close saying this. You might think that I am an asshole for having this perspective, but I would much rather you be able to walk up to me and tell me that.